This is the iDeas podcast, the show where L&D professionals discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning, other beverages may be consumed. In this episode, I chat with Angela Ross, co-founder of Sub-10, about how they design workplace content fit for the modern learner. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the iDeas podcast. Welcome back. With me today is Angela. Angela, thank you so much for making the time to speak to us today.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I do appreciate the platform and the time. Thank you.
Before we dive in fully, the reason people actually tune in to this podcast, of course, is to find out what people are drinking as they chat about learning. So, what have you got today?
Well, as it's quite early, I do have a cup of tea. A little bit boring and traditional, but it whets the thirst, doesn't it? So it serves a purpose.
Absolutely. So I've gone similar, but I've gone coffee.
Okay.
But I've got my new not paint water mug, which is more important than you might think.
It's a great label, isn't it?
Needs to be very clearly marked.
Yeah, you don't want to confuse the two.
So, as I always do, I'm terrible at introductions, so I'll hand over to you, Angela, to introduce yourself and what it is that you do.
Of course, thank you. So I'm Angela Ross, and I'm one of the co-founders at a company called Sub-10. So we create online compliance training, or education as I prefer. And we've been doing that for about 4 years now. There is a bit of a past behind me, of course. I've had about 20 years kind of designing instructional design, and prior to that I was a teacher. So yeah, a lot of education pedagogy there. And actually way back I was an archaeologist, so exciting past.
Yeah, wasn't it? This show is going to take a funny turn right out the gates, everyone. That's fascinating because that was totally what I wanted to be all the way through school. Yes. I had a short stint of I'd quite like to be a teacher. Quickly realised that was a terrible idea, even as a student. Sorry, I'm sure to some people it's a wonderful job and you love it. Maybe it's just the school I was at, but the teachers were amazing. But I thought I would kill at least 7 people a day in this job.
It's
so
tricky. I have to say,
not for me.
Being a teacher is completely underestimated. Everyone thinks it's holidays. It's a lot of planning. So I hat off to all the teachers out there. A lot of respect.
To be honest, even if all those holidays were holidays, again, from my observation, I'd certainly go, yeah, I think you'd need that. I couldn't do it even if they were holidays, even though they're not. But then, the archaeology thing, that was that was what I kind of went, I'm totally going to do this, and then realised I just had no head for dates, key facts or information, and went, that's probably not the line of work I should be looking at then.
I loved it, I have to say, and I do use some of the skills, obviously not digging trenches in the ground and that sort of thing anymore, but I do use some of that evidence gathering, working out what's going on, creating reports. I think a lot of that fed into doing instructional design, if I'm honest. A lot of that came into play when I'm looking at new information and working out what it means and piecing it all back together.
Well, that's got to be the most different way into instructional design we've ever heard about, which is awesome. So we were kind of chatting just before we started recording, and I mentioned that I've always sort of watched what you've been doing and what your organisation's been doing, and sort of thinking this is very different to a lot of what others are doing. So I'd be really interested, just to kick us off, to hear a little bit about the kind of the ethos and the approach that underpins what you do.
Of course, as you say, everything we're doing is kind of radical. It is different, and on purpose. It was really born out of a frustration that I think a lot of people perhaps listening could resonate with. If you've been in that sector where you're creating training, particularly compliance-based training for companies, it can be exceedingly dry. It's very often these one-off experiences that go out once a year. We've all sat them. You've done your fire safety training, your health and safety training. You get it once a year, and it's a one-off experience that everybody does the same thing. So it's not tailored for you. It's not adapted for you. So about 4 years ago, myself and my co-founder, who's called Peter Stevenson, he came from more of the production gaming background. He does studio production, and then he moved into e-learning production. And myself as an instructional designer, we worked predominantly for our competition. So everyone who's out there now, who's the competition, you know, all the big e-learning companies that you see at learning tech events once a year. I worked for most of them either in a freelance capacity or full-time. I was frustrated by what was being put out. I mean, I was told, we've sold this as a 60-minute course, put everything in there and the kitchen sink. And you kind of think, okay, well, what's the impact going to be, you know, for the learner going through that experience? What are they gaining from that? I was also frustrated by the lack of feedback that I got as an instructional designer. You know, I never found out, you know, how people found the experience. Did they enjoy it? Was it fun? To your point earlier that we were talking about, you know, was it an experience that worked? Did they get better at whatever they were meant to be doing? Did those learning objectives come across and resonate? And I was also frustrated that I felt that they weren't being measured. So for a customer, for example, for an HR person coming in and buying quite an expensive piece of content, I was frustrated on their behalf that they weren't getting maybe the best approach. The other added element to this is the fact that people in that space need to buy, so HR managers, founders of smaller businesses need to buy content and then a platform, typically two different providers giving both. So you end up with this sort of clunky content management system and then these quite expensive courses and lots of setup. And if you haven't got the experience or the know-how, and it's a noisy market out there for both LMS systems, learning management systems, and content, I actually think these time precious customers are suffering. So with all of that frustration, myself and the co-founder said, we can do this differently. There must be a way of doing this differently and creating a product that really works and is effective, but also one that is underpinned by something that will enhance the learning. Part of my frustration as an education practitioner was that I felt that the experiences we were putting out didn't land well. And how could you expect, you know, with things like the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, after a number of weeks and months, people start to forget what you've told them unless they're actively using it. I thought, again, how do we improve this? So what we've done at Sub-10, and the name reflects the ethos, everything that we do is 10 minutes or less. So each of our learning units that we create is 10 minutes or under. Typically it could be 2-minute animation, 3-minute video, a 4-minute e-learning piece, a 2-minute PDF that you read through. And each of the learning units, if you imagine them like little blocks, and each of the units have one learning outcome. And there's a reason for that. So if you can imagine your learning pathway for a minute, Tom, that would be very different to mine, but we can use the same basic blocks. So for example, if we have a diversity, equity and inclusion course, we could have a number of blocks. It could be 50, 60, 70 blocks or units of learning, and each one addresses a different point. So the learning point or objective could be, what is diversity? I might know that already. I might be proving that I know it through answering questions, etc. So we can actually use the blocks to understand what learning pathway works for you. So the whole point of Sub-10 was to enable this flexible learning approach, but to combine the platform and the content so they work almost symbiotically together. So the learning ethos is embedded within the learning platform and in the content. So everything we do with the platform picks up on the fact that these units almost have like a little barcode on them that identify what the learning outcome is, what the format is. So it recognizes immediately as a platform that this unit has this label on it. And if you require that, if we assess from the data we're gathering on the platform that you need it, Tom, we'll pop it into your learning pathway. And we can monitor a lot about progress, about success. We can allow the units to be deployed over time so that you're not just getting that one-off once a year experience. We're continuing to kind of enhance your learning journey, do the refreshers as and when we identify that you need them. By adding, almost intersplicing between the units, we'll add these little quiz options that will test. It could be an interaction, it could be a quiz. It adds a bit of pace to your learning experience. So for example, if you were doing 1 or 2 a week, again, we like spaced out learning. So we actually appreciate the gap between the learning experiences. And then with the quizzes, we can assess, did you do well or didn't you do well? And almost have that feedback loop. so we can then put into your pathway all the bits that you need as a learner. That's it in a kind of a big nutshell, I'd have to say. It might trigger some questions from yourself, Tom. I don't know if that makes sense. It's one of these visual things that if I could just show you what it looks like and then point it all out, I think for me, I'm a visual learner, so I kind of appreciate that approach. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the umbrella term, if you will, although it seems to be a very, very large umbrella and a lot of the stuff under it doesn't seem to be particularly micro,
Yeah.
but it seems to me that when people talk about microlearning, this is kind of what they're talking about,
Yeah.
but not necessarily what gets delivered come the end. Because I can certainly relate to your experience of working or freelancing for some of the bigger players, and as you say, being told the kind of, oh, it's a nice, short, snappy 45-minute, 60-minute course. And you're like, oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
We have different definitions here, don't we? So with that in such a core part of what you do, why did you I think we all know why you don't want big 60-minute courses at this point. But obviously this seems to be, I don't want to say like an extreme version of micro, but generally speaking, it's kind of, 15, 20 minutes. That's pretty short. That's pretty quick. Here, as you say, we're talking about maybe a couple of minutes. So what kind of drove you or informed you to go that short?
It's great that you mentioned micro learning, because I always sort of freak out when someone says that. I'm like, no. In my mind, micro learning is very chopped up, whereas we like to kind of flip that on its head and build up. So what we're trying to do is create an experience or a curriculum from the pieces. And that was another thing that really I found to be a problem with the way corporate training in particular was designed and how it was done. It didn't seem to have a framework. Yeah. Okay, there may be a policy in the background, but in terms of a structure for your learning, there didn't seem to be much cohesion around what you're learning. You do the same. I mean, literally, if I take my sister as an example, she's an air traffic controller and she's done the same fire safety training year after year after year for 30 years. She could have been a fire warden by now. She could have been an expert in it if she'd been given 30 years of progressive learning, but she wasn't. And it's almost disrespectful to put people through the same thing year after year. So what we were trying to create was the opportunity to build curriculums. So using these, because everything is designed out of a curriculum like the national curriculum for schools. As an education practitioner in the past, that is very heavily frameworked. You have the key learning outcomes you must meet year after year until you progress and you graduate or you leave school. So it's about how can we do that in a corporate environment where you don't often have that framework. It's just, we need this training, we have the budget, push it out. And we wanted to create a platform that was intelligently delivering that learning. So not micro learning, but more built up, not chopped up, I think is the right approach. And it seemed to work well. We've actually proven it out. So our product is about coming on for 6 months in terms of that development. Okay. In terms of the platform and the content, we've got about 100 units on there, various different topics that we cover off, from code of conduct, anti-money laundering. But we actually proved the ethos before we put it into the product. We thought, let's do the one-to-one, and if that works, we'll do the one-to-many. So let's see if these short units resonate and land, test them with the customer base, see the reaction. Because the other point is we want to build on data. We want to understand what the feedback is from the learner, and we want it to be almost dynamic. So we want to rate units, and if they don't like units, we want to switch them out with a variant. And that might be a personal approach. So Tom, you might really enjoy video. I like animations. We've got variants for each of our learning outcomes. So if you got to the what is diversity unit and the PDF didn't land with you because it was a bit passive, we can check your understanding and then push later in your pathway a short video which addresses the same learning outcome until you get that, and we could tick that off and you've got that learning outcome. And then we might 6 months later check you've still got it, and do it in a subtle way. And the shorter units will allow us to do that. So that was why we wanted to really push for that. And it worked in terms of proving it out to the one-to-one. So when we were doing bespoke solutions for some of the bigger companies, like we've got a FTSE 100 company, we did their 5 top compliance subjects, covered those off, created over 100 units for them. We start to measure the impact from the learner's point of view, and we've got some really positive results, hence rolling it out into our product.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because I think that's there. We kind of talk a lot, especially on this channel, about the need to adopt exactly that kind of approach, that kind of whether or not it's rapid prototype or an MVP or a very polished piece, but putting something out as quickly as or as early as possible in the journey to test it with a real audience. Because I think beyond certainly once you get into the world of does this work, I think those that work in L&D become very bad judges of what's actually going to work with the audience, because it's we can't get away from what we are, right? I always say, as much as I would love to rebrand to something else in the L&D space because people have got cooler titles now, I'm an instructional designer through and through. It's everything that I've learned and done and do. It's kind of too late to escape that at this point. It's my doom, if you will. But therefore, every bit of instruction I look at it through the eyes of an instructional designer. I'm never going to look at it as though I'm an end user ever again, most likely. So I think that it's really interesting to hear you did that with the actual product before launching it, which is interesting. So when you talk about data specifically, are you looking for? Because the field of metrics is muddied, shall we say. I spoke to someone the other week who was, on the face of it, very metrics oriented, and then sort of said, well, we track engagement based on how long they were logged into the LMS. It's like, okay. Well, I've got some bad news for you. For how much of that time was it minimized behind their actual work? It's interesting. So when you look at things, and I appreciate you may not want to share the exact ones you use for your product, but I mean, what sort of things are you looking for when you talk about metrics, about whether or not something was effective?
Sure, I think there's a lot of noise out there, as you say, with data, with trying to capture the right data, with doing it in a secure manner and an anonymized manner, so you're not necessarily breaching, GDPR. We obviously want to do that in a way that's useful, which is about us trying to understand how people go through their learning experience. So at the moment, we have a number of customers on the platform, so we can start to see the anonymized view in the background of how people complete it. And you get the ones that race through units. You get ones who do one a week, very methodical. And what that starts to do is give us the options or the opportunity to compare. So it's even like, based on how someone goes through the units, if someone races through it in kind of a mass learning experience, which we don't recommend, and we put lots of notifications in and pauses, but we will not kind of very strictly kind of stop people. We won't put in a locked unit that you have to do until you achieve it and then you move on. We've got provisions in there to give people notifications. It's really want to do learning, not have to do. We don't want to beat anyone with that velvet stick. But the type of data we can measure gives us that comparison between, very simply, how do people explore the units? How do they go through them? And does that match up or reflect on the scores they're getting within the inline quizzes that we're creating? Does the experience affect the performance? Does the reaction to a unit affect the performance? So we do have options like star ratings. We do follow some of the tricks and techniques of things like Netflix and trying to get feedback and reaction and build on that. So if we do see a unit that's flagging, we would look to understand why. Is it that the clarity of the learning isn't there? Is it that the content didn't work? And it gives us an opportunity to kind of be accountable for what we're producing. If someone consistently, say through an organization, we can look at departments. So we can look at individuals, we can look at whether they achieve a learning outcome or they don't. We can almost assess emerging risk by saying across your organization, 50% of people don't understand what diversity is. We can identify that as almost an emerging risk. We can report on to the HR person or learning and development person to flag that up. But as a platform, we want to plug that as well. We want to use that information and that data, if you like, on individual performance company-wide performance to assess where the weaknesses are within the learning and what that means from a compliance perspective, and how we can potentially in the future, with the right platform working in an intelligent way, plug those gaps by almost, again, with that barcode on each unit, we can say that's the weakness. For that individual, they can't use the right language to describe, in a diverse way. So we'll plug in a unit that does that for them. So you can start to assess and understand how people are going through, their reaction to the content, and also the performance, which we can start to look at making a more intelligent product. And we do appreciate, Tom, that this is, like you say, early days. We're about 6 months into the development of the product. We were very lucky as a business. We did get investment. We got seed investment. We are supported in the Northeast, where we're based, by our venture capitalist company and our angel investors, but also by Innovate, a UK grant, which came through from the government, which has enabled us to look at the research and development and enhance the AI. And I know if I threw that word out there, you might go, ooh, what's going on there? Because I think a lot of our competition say they've got AI-based platforms. And when you sort of look at it, it's a chatbot that filters the content. Not to belittle the competition. I'm sure there's lots of people working on lots of exciting things out there. And we're pushing to ensure that the data that we do collect, which will be everything and anything from job roles through to performance scores. We've got XAPI on everything. So we are tracking where people look on pages, how long they spend on questions. We also have, rather excitingly, sentiment analysis. We're working with a company called Word Nerds and partnering with them. And we have text entry questions throughout our content where we send the anonymized information. So if I ask you what you feel after you've looked at a harrowing animation about, because we use a lot of engagement on an emotional level. If I showed you a video of, say, what the world looks like in a corrupt society, and then ask you how did that make you feel, and you type in your response, we send that information anonymized off to Word Nerds, and they do a sentiment score on it, so you can see how negative or how positive you are about aspects that you talk about, and can start to inflect kind of behavior change off the back of that. All of that information, we want this platform, or our product, if you like, the combination of the content and the platform, to work like a teacher in the classroom. And this goes back, harping back to being a teacher and understanding that when I taught a lesson, everyone in that room, every student had a different experience based on what they needed. And I did that because I was standing there taking in information from them, taking in data, and then giving them back exactly what they needed. I challenged them when they needed to be challenged. I supported them when they needed to be supported. I enhanced what I was doing by explaining it in a different way if they needed that. And we want the platform to replicate that human element. So that's what we're designing at the moment, without giving away too much secrets.
No, it's interesting, because I think we often kind of lose that, and I kind of want to touch back on something you said earlier about content variation, because I know that makes a lot of people, I spoke about before, and the idea of cluster-based learning and all this kind of thing, it makes a lot of people very nervous, because they see it as, I want to create it once and it be one and done. Why do I need to reinvest in redesigning the same thing 3 times, 4 times, whatever it might be? So from your perspective, I mean, what's the benefit of covering potentially the same piece of content in multiple different ways inside a learning pathway?
Of course. So I come from a background of like constructivism. So I do think we build on our experiences and our knowledge. I don't think we're born inherently with everything. And I think we go through life with our senses to perceive lots of things and build what we know. And you'll find over time that you replace old knowledge and skills with new skills and knowledge, and it's a continuing dynamic thing. And for me, it was really important to be able to identify what works for individuals. I'm not sure if I totally understand that everyone's got a different learning style, because that hasn't been tested or proven. There's lots of theories out there that, we've got visual learners and we've got people who prefer podcasts. I'm not sure. And on every day, I think everyone's different. Sometimes it fits your schedule. So it might fit your schedule if you're on the way to a meeting and you want to listen to something because it's just not great. You're squashed in the tube going into London and you don't want to look at a video on a screen because everyone's looking. You just want to listen to something. So I might say it's more like environmentally driven. That I want to give people the choice that when they're going through a learning experience, they can have a video or an animation. So as I said before, you've got the learning unit with the one learning outcome, but we are designing different formats to approach that content. And we're creating like a PDF version of the same learning outcome in case someone prefers a quick read, print it off, put it on the desk, because some people like certificates and like things that are tangible that they can print off. Or if you're on the way to a meeting and you aren't driving and you're sat there, you can have a quick look at maybe a 2-3 minute video about an aspect that's going to come up in the meeting. So it just gives us the flexibility and also the evidence to maybe start to look at. I think this is going to be evidence rich, which comes again from the archaeology. Let's assess what's out there. Let's go through it. Let's use the science. Let's see what works and what doesn't work. It may be that this product evolves in the sense that we don't need so many variants of different units because actually it's little difference between whether someone does an animation or PDF. But let's see if it works. Let's see if someone goes through the experience and prefers an animation approach or not.
Yeah, I think for me certainly I've always kind of felt it's kind of like a contextual preference.
Yeah.
It's not a case of I can only learn by or I learn best by. As you say, it's what's the content, where am I, what am I doing, what's my level of interest.
Yeah.
Because certainly I find like if I really want to learn something, I love to read about it. I don't
Yeah.
particularly want to watch a video or listen about it if it's something that I really am interested in.
Yeah.
The other side of that is if it's a topic where, if I'm honest, I would not choose to ever learn anything about this whatsoever, but I have to, something like a video or an animation is
Yeah.
probably better because I don't really want to put the effort in to read, which sounds very lazy, but
I
it's kind
agree.
of the reality of it.
Yeah.
It's kind of the reason why I kind of feel like at school there were inherently subjects that I kind of went, yes, love it, and others where I went, nope, struggling with this, but it's because
Yeah.
both of them were read this textbook. And
Yes.
that context works great if you want to learn, and not so great if you kind of wish you were anywhere else but here. You know,
I agree. And we can't judge, can we? We don't know if this piece is what someone wants to know about or if they just have to do it to tick a box. And if they have to do it to tick a box, we still want them to have an engaging experience as much as possible.
this is it, because I think sometimes we forget in ourselves as L&D professionals. I feel sometimes that no matter how great your content is, some topics are stuff people don't care about. Like I've created a lot of training about GDPR. I would not say it's one of my life's passions. I would say it's a legal obligation in every job. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
you're going to meet very few people that get excited about the 7 principles and how to apply them in their job role.
I
Um,
was going to say you should say that. I mean,
you will.
there are some people who really enjoy that sort of thing. I mean, we do our best to. I mean, you can go through our content. Some of it's open on the platform. You don't even have to commit to it. You can have a look through it. And what we try and do is use techniques from film and television because we thought the same. We're kind of assessing. I mean, my thoughts and perception on it is something like money laundering. You get this heavy legislative kind of approach, this heavy formal kind of a course that you have to go through on anti-money laundering, and you want to switch off. But if we look at something like Breaking Bad, highly successful TV show all about money laundering, and it's kind of like, how did they make it attractive and engaging? People wanted to or learn about it, but through a different experience. So we do where we can add a bit of life and engagement through storytelling, characterization, personification, examples. I know people talk about scenarios sort of to death, but we do try and raise our game in terms of researching stories from a kind of a point of view, very personal kind of point of view, very emotive point of view, to try and connect with people. So it's not just here are the principles, but it's how does that apply when somebody messes up and loses your data? How do you feel? And here's a story about so and so who got into such and such trouble because somebody didn't handle their data securely. It kind of lands better.
Definitely, yeah. I think that it's that kind of one thing where if you can flip it to be a human story
Yeah.
as opposed to an information story, I think
Yes.
it always, as you roll this
Yeah.
out, I guess more and more data will be going in. And I know something that
Yeah.
struggle with is once that data's coming in, you've got this wealth of information. How do you go about, what's interesting, what's relevant, what's not? What are you trying to find in your data?
Yeah.
I know before you mentioned the sentiment stuff, which I think is I've not.
Yes.
I know some
Yeah.
people who have done it, but they've done it very manually, and it was a painful job. I know that.
Right.
But what other kind of
Yeah.
trends are you looking out for, and why? I guess.
Mm. Yeah, it's the whole impact. It's how that learning lands, and it's the enhancement of what we're doing as well. Because again, through 20 years of instructional design, nobody ever told me how successful the learning was that I'd created. I just assumed that because I'm still working, that I'm obviously doing something right and that, companies want to buy it. But from a learning perspective, I never knew. We all talk about Kirkpatrick's, the reaction to it, the kind of level one, and then the learning outcomes, the performance, and then did you inflict kind of behavioural change? Did the organisational change occur at that level 4? It's kind of like that progression. We never know how our product or our work lands, and for me that was a travesty because I lost out potentially on 20 years of improvement, even self-improvement. So I could actually understand that didn't work. They didn't like that. That didn't land well. That wasn't a great learning experience. That doesn't line up with how people learn. And I could have made improvements on my approach, which I hated. I hated the fact that I've gone through 20 years and probably didn't evolve as much as I could have. And again, that frustration came out as in when we have this product working effectively and we have all of this data coming in, we want to use machine learning, we want to analyze the AI in an intelligent way using the platform. We've got a great tech team. I can't say that I understand fully all of the tech language that comes out of Tim, who's like our lead back-end developer, comes up with the most amazing algorithms to sort through patterns and trends and look at what's happening. So we have trigger points. So if somebody goes through and a learning outcome isn't achieved, what's the trigger point? And how do we assess when is the right time for them to do a variant unit in the future? Where does that land? How does it land? When it's a week later, did that work for them? And we assess that data. So there is so much going on, if you like, under the hood in terms of the experience. We're trying to find the ways that people enjoy learning. And we're trying to understand, is that on an individual basis? Or is it across an organization? Or is it something, that's either very diverse at a personalized level, or are there trends that we can copy and mimic over time through the platform to kind of push out that gold standard and then have almost deviations off that? So most people might do the gold standard version. We assess the data, we roll things out in a certain way, but off that we have certain deviations that occur for people who learn in a slightly different way. And I think this is the most compelling and interesting thing, is this platform's going to be able to consume and churn out in different reports this data. We already have a report mechanism on it for potentially for HR people to kind of, report on what's happening within their organization. So as I alluded to before, the primary thing we've got in this first version is really to assess the learning outcomes. Because we've got that granular approach, we want to see through a core set of units, when people have gone through, what learning outcomes have they achieved, and where they haven't, we want to plug those in later, and we want to assess what's the right time to plug those in. We want to also then potentially in the future start to look at how we diarize those units going forward. So there may be an opportunity to, if someone allows us to look at their teams for example. We've got the calendar there. We can say or suggest or nudge or say, you've got half a day here. Do you fancy doing a unit? You've got a meeting coming up about topic X. Would a unit beforehand be useful? And communicating too through the appropriate channels, whether it's a Teams chat, nudging things out in the right way so it's not that horrible formal kind of email that you get. And I wanted our team to be looking at how do we remind people that the training's sitting there? How do we remind people to come back? What sort of notifications are we doing? We don't want to do push notifications. We don't want to do those horrible emails that say you're going to be fired if you don't do your compliance training by Friday at 6 o'clock. We want to find techniques that they use in psychology, the advertising world, ways of enticing you back. The things that obviously work on Facebook or LinkedIn, where you get the little red dot that says someone's messaged you and you get really excited and go in and have a look. We want to find ways of pulling people back to the training, which could be as simple as reminding them of the value that understanding this topic brings, which I like the harrowing emotive side. I like to say, what would society look like if we have bribery and corruption rife in our streets? What would society look like? And these little reminders, little short pieces, interactions, trying and testing. And I think that's the critical thing. And my appreciation of data is the ability to look at trends, to look at patterns. But with our system, you can actually look at individuals as well. If you wanted to, you could get down to what works for this person on that day. And therefore, for this person in a similar situation on another day, we can replicate that. And that's where that sort of algorithm approach comes into play.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think it's such a kind of developing space there, because I think for a long time we've had a lot of data floating around. I would say every LMS back to the first has been very good at just grabbing data and holding on to it. But I don't necessarily think neither the platforms nor, to be honest, the kind of professional capability have been there to really harness that data properly. Like, I know certainly in my experience, my default when I was in-house was to go, great, thank you very much for this data. I'm lucky enough that I'm going to take this to the BI team and let them sort this out, because I haven't got a clue what to do with it. And they would say, oh, well, this isn't working and that's working and this has happened, I don't know why. And then we'd try and figure it out. But I think the kind of element that's often missed in that conversation is the fact that data itself doesn't really tell us anything. It's just data. You've got to be able to find the trends and ultimately the story in what that data is telling you. And I feel like the platform is one side of that, definitely, and the other side of it then is a skill that either needs to be developed or brought in to L&D teams, or if you're lucky enough to have a business intelligence gauge with them, rather than acting as kind of like a separate entity. I know as L&D people, we like to go, no, we will get the skill, we'll upskill, we'll learn another thing, but you can only wear so many hats. And like,
we're good at that. You don't want to spread yourself too thin, because I know even instructional designers who do articulate development, who do the graphics, who do everything, who do the content research, and you're suddenly the company. You are the company. You're the one person running everything.
This is it, which I think is I think that there's the danger of you burning out. But also, I think in those scenarios, there is a danger that if you do everything, you're not necessarily getting other people's input along the way. Even if you're the only, quote unquote, learning expert in the team, having, a visual designer who might say, just want to flag that the coherency on this doesn't seem right, or this UI isn't working, or those kind of things. Those conversations, I think, are invaluable.
Absolutely. You've got to appreciate a diverse team, and I mean cognitive diversity as much as anything. Different backgrounds, different experiences. We actually thought we were quite blessed because the tech team that we have, headed up by Kev Price, who's our Chief Product Officer, but he has no experience in the learning side. So he's come to this fresh, and he's come to this with no previous idea about what a learning management system looks like or does. And one of my pet peeves, if you like, in the past is I feel like we've clung on to like this content management system, this clunky thing, and we've tried to evolve it. We've made it into an LXP, and we've, you know, learning experience platform, and we've just kind of, I always say lipstick on a pig. We've just made it look better, but like underneath, it's sort of doing the same of the old stuff. We need to almost throw it away and come up with something that is doing what we need it to do, something that's clever, something that actually improves the learning experience, something that's part of the learning experience, rather than something that just enables you to check the box. And that's literally just what a lot of content management systems do. So we were privileged, I think, by having a tech team that had none of that previous baggage. They've come up with a lot of fresh approaches.
No, definitely. I think it's interesting. I think the products that are exciting in the EdTech space, I do tend to find come through that route. Because I think you're exactly right. When you're, whether it's platforms or authoring tools or plugins, the best stuff is not being driven by, or not solely driven by super experienced L&D people. You tend to find they're having a lot of input around learning, but not controlling the tech side of things, which I think historically has been a bit of an issue. You can kind of, I don't know, I feel like when you look at products like, I don't know, I love Articulate, use it all the time, but you can tell it's a very established EdTech company. It would not survive in any other industry. Let's put it that way. You know, we are, I think, on the whole, overly forgiving of technology because we're kind of used to going, oh, well, that's Moodle. And oh well, that's
that's Articulate.
This it. We kind of do it so often, we forget that if a web designer did that, they'd be sacked. They just wouldn't survive. So it's an interesting space that I think hopefully is moving forwards at some pace now. As we get some less learning focused
busier, isn't it?
Well, yes.
I know it's getting noisier. I think the one thing I would encourage is anyone listening who is an instructional designer is to try and be brave and go that bit further. If you've got a great idea, or you can be that entrepreneur and start something yourself, because that was something that was missing. Certainly, there was nobody I looked to see. You know, anyone who ran the businesses that I worked for previously had no learning experience and no idea what good learning looked like. Again, another apology out there to anyone I've worked for previously, but they were very good at business but not good at learning. So I think anyone out there who's got that ambition and knows what they're doing in a learning space should try and fight to the forefront and start to create things and put things out there, because they could really make a difference.
Definitely. Well, I was going to ask as a kind of clue. Yeah, kind of. As a fantastic sort of note there. But I always like to finish up on a question or a space right now. What is it that you see and get really excited about and think, yes, I want more of that in the future?
I'm excited that because when I started, you couldn't find anything to do with instructional design. I started 2001 doing eLearning, and it was a very lonely place, I have to say. There were like script writers and people trying to put things online. So I'm really excited to go to like a learning tech event and just see the traction, see the energy, see all the people who are enthused by digital training. I mean, an unfortunate or maybe fortunate side effect of the pandemic was a lot of things went online. A lot of these workshops became digital training. Again, maybe not the best quality, but I'm excited by the will and the traction that seems to be there to change things. I'm excited by, honestly, people like yourself, Tom, who speak about the topic, who put forward a platform for people like ourselves who've come from an instructional design background to be able to talk. I like that energy that seems to be around. I mean, it's a noisy market with lots of products and lots of ideas, and I think some of them will fall by the wayside, and I'm hoping that people come forward, express their ideas, are happy to explore how people learn, and there's a lot more conversation around effective, engaging learning, because all that can do is enhance the end user experience, which at the end of the day, we want something that actually works. So I like that part.
Definitely. No, that's a great answer. But again, thank you so much for your time for recording this show. If people want to get in touch, where can they find you online?
Of course. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn. You can search for me, Angela Ross, and it's under a company called Sub-10. That's sub-10. We do have our website, so you can go to www.sub-10.co.uk if you want to find out more. But I'm happy if anyone wants to message me directly on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. And we will have links to all of that in the description of this episode. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the iDeas podcast. Before you go, please let us know in the comments what you're taking away from this conversation and how you might implement it. If you enjoyed the episode, remember to hit the like button and consider subscribing to the Instructional Design Tips YouTube channel. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.